You don't actually understand what you think you know. You just memorize the labels. Most of our knowledge is a fragile house of cards built on fancy terminology that hides massive logical gaps. And by stripping away every jargon-filled safety net, we're going to rebuild your entire worldview from absolute zero. But before we do that, I want to ask you something honest. When was the last time you sat down to learn something, genuinely tried to understand it, and then quietly closed the tab, put down the book, or locked your phone? Not because you were finished, but because something inside you just gave up. Not dramatically, not with a breakdown, just a slow, quiet surrender. A subtle decision to do it later, tomorrow, when you feel more ready. If that sounds familiar, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not with shame, with curiosity. Because what most people call laziness or distraction or lack of discipline is actually something far more interesting and far more human. Story we have been told about intelligence. It goes something like this. Some people are just naturally smart. They pick things up quickly. They remember what they read. They make connections effortlessly. And if you are not one of those people, well, you work harder, but you will always be playing catch-up. This story is so old that most of us stopped questioning it. We absorbed it in childhood, confirmed it through school report cards, reinforced it every time someone else seemed to understand something faster than we did. And slowly, quietly, it became identity. Not just a belief about ability, but a belief about the self. Here's what's worth knowing. That story is not psychology, it is mythology. Howard Gardner spent decades asking a question that most education systems had never seriously entertained. What if intelligence was not one thing? What if the human brain was not a single engine running at different speeds, but an entire orchestra, each section capable of things the others could not do? His theory of multiple intelligences was not simply a feel-good idea for struggling students. It was a structural challenge to how we define what a mind is capable of. Some people think in music, some in spatial patterns, some in physical movement, some in the emotional texture of relationships. None of these modes of intelligence show up on a standardized test, but they are all deeply, functionally real. What this means for you is not a hall pass from difficult thinking. It means the kind of understanding you are capable of may look very different from the kind you were trained to perform, and that difference matters enormously. Bloom had a different kind of question. He wanted to know what happens between not knowing something and truly knowing it. Not just the destination, but the terrain in between. What he found, through years of studying how students actually learn, is that knowledge has depth. There is a version of understanding that sits only at the surface, where you can recognize a term, repeat a definition, maybe even pass a test. And there is another version, buried much deeper, where you can take an idea apart, examine each piece, rebuild it in a new form, and use it to think with, not just talk with. Most of us live almost entirely in the shallow end, and we don't even know it, because the shallow end has all the same vocabulary as the deep end. It sounds the same, it feels like understanding, until the moment someone asks you to explain it without the textbook language, and suddenly you realize the words were doing the thinking for you. This is not a flaw in your character, it's a flaw in how most learning is structured, intuitively. He was one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century, but more than his equations, what distinguished him was his near-obsessive commitment to honest understanding. He believed, deeply and without compromise, that if you could not explain something in plain language, you did not understand it yet. You had merely borrowed someone else's explanation and filed it under your own name. He developed a method for himself, not for students, for himself. Because he didn't trust the feeling of understanding, he knew the feeling could lie. The method was simple. Take a blank page, write the concept at the top, then explain it, in full, as if you were teaching a curious 12-year-old who had no background in the subject. No technical language, no borrowed frameworks, just the raw idea in your own words. When you hit a wall, and you will hit a wall, that wall is not a sign of failure. It is the most important information the process gives you. That wall marks the exact location of your gap, the precise place where your understanding runs out and borrowed vocabulary begins. Most people avoid that wall their entire lives. Think about what happens in the brain when you encounter something unfamiliar. There's a brief moment of cognitive discomfort, a kind of mental friction, and your nervous system, which is exquisitely calibrated for efficiency, wants to resolve that friction as quickly as possible. So it reaches for the nearest familiar pattern, attaches a known label, files it away, and moves on. The discomfort disappears. You feel like you understand. But what actually happened was pattern matching, not comprehension. This is not stupidity. This is your brain doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's conserving energy by finding shortcuts. The problem is that when we're trying to genuinely understand something, shortcuts are the enemy. They feel productive. They feel like learning. But they are, in neurological terms, the difference between building a structure and painting a picture of one on the wall. Real understanding requires something uncomfortable and slow. It requires holding the confusion open long enough to actually move through it. This is where the Feynman Notebook Method becomes something more than a productivity tip. It becomes a form of psychological honesty. The notebook is not a place where you perform understanding. It's a place where you stop performing. You sit down, you open to a blank page, and you write what you actually know, not what you think you're supposed to know, not the summary from the article, not the professor's phrasing, what you, with your current mind, can genuinely account for. For most people, the first time they do this, the page stays mostly empty. And that emptiness is deeply uncomfortable. But here's what Feynman knew, and what Bloom's research confirmed, and what cognitive neuroscience has since added its weight to. The brain does not consolidate understanding passively. It consolidates it through active reconstruction. Every time you retrieve something, restate it, attempt to teach it, or apply it to a new context, the neural pathways associated with that knowledge become stronger, more precise, and more retrievable under pressure. You are not recording information, you are building architecture. And architecture requires friction, it requires testing, it requires the honest discovery of which walls are load-bearing and which ones are decorative.
There is another layer here that rarely gets discussed. Emotion is not separate from learning. It is one of its most powerful drivers. William James, the father of American psychology, wrote extensively about the relationship between attention and feeling. He observed that we cannot sustain genuine attention on something that holds no felt significance for us. Not discipline, not willpower, not routine can fully compensate for the absence of meaning. This is why so much of what we try to learn simply does not stick, not because we are incapable, but because we never connected it to anything that matters to us personally. We tried to learn in a vacuum, as if the mind were a storage drive, indifferent to context. The Feynman method, done honestly, forces a different relationship. When you try to explain something in your own words, you're forced to connect it to what you already understand, to your existing map of the world. And that connection, that moment of personal translation, is exactly what creates memory that lasts. Gardner would say you are learning in your native intelligence. Bloom would say you are moving from recognition into genuine synthesis. Feynman would simply say you are stopping the lie. I want to acknowledge something directly. There is a version of you that has tried things like this before. Journaling systems, elaborate note-taking methods, deep work schedules. And for a while, something stirred, maybe a week, maybe two of real clarity and momentum. And then life returned to its normal texture, the method faded, and you quietly filed it alongside all the other things you almost did. I am not going to tell you that this time will be different because you are finally ready or because you have finally found the right system. What I will say is this. The version of you that starts and stops is not broken. That person is experiencing something psychologically real. There is genuine cognitive cost to changing how you think. The brain resists structural change the same way a city resists rezoning, not out of laziness, but out of systemic inertia. Every habit of thought, Every shortcut, every comfortable pattern of understanding has been laid down over years. Asking yourself to think differently is asking the city to rebuild its roads. It is possible. Neuroplasticity is not a metaphor. The brain physically changes with use, but it changes slowly, and it changes through repetition, not revelation. This is not a call to hustle harder. It is an invitation to be more patient with the process than you have been with yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, not for publication, not for posterity, but for himself. Confine yourself to the present. He was not talking about productivity. He was talking about the difference between understanding as performance and understanding as practice. The journal was his blank page, his version of the Feynman Notebook, a place to find out, honestly and privately, what he actually believed, as opposed to what he was supposed to believe. There is something quietly radical about that. The idea that clarity does not require an audience, that the most important thinking you will ever do is the thinking no one else will see. So here is what this method, at its deepest level, is really asking of you. Not that you become smarter, not that you optimize your cognitive performance, but that you become honest about where your understanding actually lives and patient enough to build it properly, from the ground up, in your own language, using your own connections, at your own pace. The result is not a person who knows more. It is a person who knows differently, more clearly, more quietly, more genuinely. And that kind of knowing does not announce itself. It simply shows up in the questions you ask, the connections you notice, the ideas you no longer need to perform because they have become genuinely, structurally yours.
Here is the one thing I want you to carry with you from this. Understanding is not a feeling. It is a structure. And a structure can always be tested, rebuilt, and strengthened. The only honest question is not how smart you are, but how solid the foundation actually is. Take a blank page. Pick one idea you believe you understand. Explain it to yourself in plain language from absolute zero. See what holds. See what crumbles. What crumbles is where your real learning begins. If something in this conversation stayed with you, there's a reason for that. The next video continues exactly where this one ends, because there are questions this method raises that need their own space to breathe. Questions about why we resist clarity, how identity shapes what we allow ourselves to learn, and what it would mean to stop performing knowledge and start building it. It is there whenever you are ready.